Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 11th Annual Utah Hauntings Contest at the Angelus Theater. I'm your host, Stephen Gashler. I am the director of the Utah Hauntings Contest, as well as Great Hall Theatrical Experiences, which is putting on this show tonight. We want to thank our sponsors, Take My Death Away, which brought us this beautiful haunting set. We have 6 spooky storytellers tonight who are going to compete to tickle your spine. Half of the judging will be determined by the audience votes, and the other half will be determined by judges. We have 4 judges in our midst who will be judging by length, making sure it doesn't go over time, making sure it's a proper, spooky, skin-crawling story. And your job as well is to vote for your favorites. All right, so with no further ado, we will now jump in with our first storyteller tonight.
For Zell, Sam, and Morgan, 3 17-year-olds. The night started just like many ordinary nights in many ordinary houses, with a video game night. They had just finished finals the past week, and now they decided to celebrate by getting together and playing Call of Duty. And if you've ever played Call of Duty, you know there's a lot of shooting, a lot of stabbing, a lot of stabbing, and a lot of army crawling, and more stabbing, and it's great if you're totally into that thing. Which Sam and Zell were. In fact, they stayed up till 2 a.m. at this particular point, playing that game nonstop. Now, Morgan, who had had an inconsistent sleep schedule at this point and had had his bout with exhaustion, decided to turn in early. About 2:30 a.m., Sam decided that he was hungry. And Zell sent him to the kitchen and asked him to make a sandwich for the both of them. So Sam goes downstairs, right to the kitchen door. He opens it up, the refrigerator door, sorry. The refrigerator door opens it up, which is right underneath the freezer. And right then and there, he grabs a plate and starts making his sandwich inside the fridge without even closing it. He starts assembling one sandwich, ham, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, moves on over, ham, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, and then the signature ingredient, the mustard, he adds on with a little at the end. Just as he was getting ready to turn, he looks up and he sees over the top of the refrigerator door a pair of eyes looking right at him. They had this menacing look on them. He freaks out, grabbing a hold even tighter of the sandwich that was in his hand. He's like, "Whoa!" And then there was this slow creak as the refrigerator door started to close. And right there, standing, was Morgan, with the continued menacing look on his face. Sam must have stood there with his heart racing that entire time for about a minute total, wondering what in the world Morgan was doing there, looking at him with this menacing look on his face. And finally, he had had a recollection of something that he had heard in school about sleepwalkers. And he came to the conclusion Morgan was sleepwalking, right there. He looked at him the whole time. He did not break eye contact with Sam at all. He just stood there. Sam tried to speak up to break the ice. "Hey, Morgan, are you asleep?" No answer. "All right, well, I'm going to grab my sister's sandwich and head upstairs." He carefully walks over to the refrigerator door, opens it up again, grabs his sister's sandwich, and with the two, he starts to head upstairs. Looking back, Morgan's still. Same menacing look, looking right at him, hasn't moved. Just as he's getting ready to make the first step, Morgan starts to inch his way backwards toward the kitchen counter. And as he continues to make eye contact, he starts to take his hand on the back counter and start fumbling around like he's feeling for something. And his hand comes into contact with his car keys. Now, Sam becomes interested because he had read somewhere that sleepwalkers will often take drives out in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. They'll try to drive, they'll try to follow some consistent routine that they had during the day. His hand makes contact with the keys, but then goes right over them. Then he goes over the kitchen sink. He goes over the dishes, the clean dishes that are sitting right next to it, and gradually makes its way over to the knife container. His hand comes into contact with the handle of each and every knife in that knife container until it settles on the largest knife. he pulls it out. And then Sam notices something that he didn't notice before. As he was watching Morgan's hand do all this, he noticed there were gloves on his hand, black gloves. And so when his hand grabs the knife, this time, still not breaking eye contact, he starts to edge his way forward with the knife. Sam freaks out. He runs upstairs. He's like, oh no. His sister meets him in the hallway. And he's like, hey, what is it? What is it? He's like, it's Morgan. He's coming at me with a knife. Like, what? Morgan's coming at me with a knife. What are you talking about? Morgan is in the kitchen with a knife. Well, hang on, calm down, slow down. She starts to make her way toward the kitchen. She looks downstairs. She's like, I don't see anybody there. What? Sure enough, they go downstairs. He follows his sister very carefully going downstairs. Morgan is nowhere to be found. And she's like, are you sure you saw what you saw? And he's like, I'm absolutely sure I saw what I saw. Well, last time I saw Morgan, he was sleeping. What if he's still there? So they go to the room that Morgan had set aside to start sleeping, and sure enough, he was laying there, sleeping. Sam didn't know what to do. And she's like, listen, we've had a long night. We've been playing this game. I'm sure our nerves are all in a bunch. Just, how about you go downstairs where you left my sandwich, bring it back up, we'll have a nice snack, and then we'll play one more round before we go to bed. So Sam goes back downstairs to grab the sandwich. The sister, Zell, goes into her room where she goes to check her phone and make sure there were any messages she didn't, that she hadn't responded to yet or anything. And then she feels Sam come and sit right next to her. And she, as she's looking at her phone, just checking the message, she just reaches over in a loving way and starts to fumble her fingers through Sam's hair. But when she focuses on what she's actually feeling, she realizes the texture is very different. And she turns, and it's Morgan. Those same eyes with the same menacing look staring at her right there. She screams and freaks out, gets out of bed, goes and tries to back away into a corner. Morgan, this time, starts walking toward her, knife in hand and gloves, just like Sam had described earlier, but was walking toward her. Then she freaks out, goes into the closet, tries to close it, and you can hear this. Closet door starts to jiggle. She tries to get to it in time to keep it closed, but it is unsuccessful. And then on the other side of the closet is Sam. He's like, hey, what's the matter? She's like, it was Morgan. Just like you said, he was right there. I saw him looking at me, and he had this knife in his hand, and he said, exactly, that's what I saw. What are we going to do? I don't know. What's going on? Well, I think he's sleepwalking. When have you ever heard of a sleepwalker grabbing a knife in their sleep? I don't know. What do we do? Where is he? So they both make their way to the door, peer into the hallway, and turn. And there, standing at the end of the hallway, is Morgan, looking straight at them as they both peer with their heads around the door like this. A good 20 seconds goes on. He doesn't move. Then he takes one step, and they were done. They go inside the room, they close the door, they lock the door, and they say, we're not coming out at all the rest of the evening. They decide to eat their sandwiches and go to bed. Now, Mom had been out all night because she had to work a graveyard shift at the hospital as a nurse. She comes and makes her way into the house about 6 o'clock a.m. She goes to bed. Morgan wakes up the next day around 7 o'clock. He's gotten a little bit of rest, so he's doing okay. And he wonders where Sam and Zell are. So he goes and he starts looking around first in the room where they were playing the game. They weren't there. Then he goes and looks all around the house, perhaps in the kitchen, bathroom, nowhere to be found. Then he goes to Zell's room. He goes to turn the knob on the door, and it's locked. Like, okay. Well, about 30 minutes pass, and he decides to knock on the door and try to wake them up. No answer. After about 30 minutes of waiting, he gets a little discouraged. He goes and wakes up their mom, and he says, hey, I've tried knocking on Zell and Sam's door. They won't answer. And so together they break down the door, and right inside they see Zell and Sam on the floor, dead. The police were called. They show up to the house. They come and investigate. An autopsy was ordered, and they found a dose of cyanide in their system. When the autopsy report came back and the investigation was conducted, their first suspicion was that it was the mom. Being a nurse, she would have access to all of these harmful chemicals at work. And having access to latex gloves that are black, she would be able to perform a crime and not leave any fingerprints. But when they found a container of pesticide in Zell's backpack that she had brought home from school to nurture these plants that she was in charge of keeping alive for a science project, they concluded and ruled that it was a suicide. That she had killed her brother first and then decided to end her own life. What they did not know was that if they had simply checked the garbage before it was taken out, they would have found the mustard container. And if they would have found the mustard container and examined the contents therein, they would have found that there was a little bit of cyanide that had been added to the end. And Morgan had appeared on the scene just in time to scare them before they noticed the reactions in their body take place. Through this experience, Morgan would decide to become a cop many years later. And in becoming a cop, when he wasn't solving the crimes that he was immediately focused on, he would dedicate time to hunting his best friend's killer. Until one night, he had a dream. And in this dream, he was following Sam downstairs as he made a sandwich. And he was observing that when Sam closed the refrigerator door, there were these eyes staring at him. And he could never see the figure, but he noticed that the figure was wearing black gloves. And later that evening, this figure would go into his car, and the gloves would fall on the side of the seat. And the car looked suspiciously like Morgan's car. He would go out to his car, and not having cleaned his car in a very long time, he would find a pair of black latex gloves.
So not too long ago, my family decided to go on a trip. This trip was to a little town in Nevada called Pioche. A little bit of history of Pioche. Pioche is a town, it was a mining town back in the day. This mining town was part of the Wild Wild West. It had enough deaths happen there that it took 80% of all the deaths for that year in the whole state of Nevada. We went there because our great-great-great-great-grandpa, 3 or 4 greats, I don't remember which one, he was a merchant that sold there before the mercantile exploded. And we wanted to go check out just a little bit more about that town and kind of figure it out. So we go down and we book an Airbnb and we get there. We go inside and it's got this old chimney, a nice little fireplace and a chimney, and it's a very old school time. Well, we decided we're going to get all settled. And as we do that, the wind blows through the chimney. Bloody fingers, 5 miles away. The wind stopped and died down. Wind happens. I've lived around one of those before where wind just comes and blows through and it makes some interesting noises sometimes. No big deal. So we decide we want to make some dinner. So we go and we start cooking and getting everything ready for dinner. When the wind picks up again and blows across the chimney top. Bloody fingers 4 miles away. The wind disappeared again. Well, dinner was done. We sat down to eat. As we're eating, we're talking and enjoying ourselves. As dinner started to wind down, the wind picked up a third time. Bloody fingers 3 miles away. Again, the wind making noise, something that I've heard before. It's not a big deal. It's nothing to worry about. We get dishes all cleaned up, and we want to play a game. So we pull out all of our board games that we brought with us, because car ride is a long ways, and we want to have something to do. And rather than being on our phones where half the time it's dead, doesn't make any sense. So we had all these different board games. And we pull out one, and we set it up, and we start to play. When the wind, again, picks up. Bloody fingers 2 miles away. The wind disappeared. At this point, I'm looking a little bit more concerned, because I'm pretty sure at this point, I'm like, what is going on? I swear I just heard that there was bloody fingers like 2 miles away. Whatever, that's not a big deal. Well, the game finished, and we're putting it away, and we want dessert. So we go and we open up the little freezer that they had, and we pull out the ice cream. We scoop and put it in these little bowls. When the wind picks up again. Bloody fingers 1 mile away. The wind left again. At this point, what is going on? Bloody fingers keeps getting closer and closer and closer, and this is not a good thing. We eat our ice cream and are just about ready to go to bed when the wind blows one more time. Bloody fingers at your door. There was a knock at our door. I look over at my family. Are you guys gonna go get it? No, go ahead. Fine. Walk over to the door. Trembling hands, grab that doorknob, twist it open. On the other side is this young man. He's got his hands kind of held like this. He looks at me and says, "Sir, can I get a Band-Aid, please? I've been working in the mines all day, and I ended up cutting my fingers. Can I get a Band-Aid?" I look at him, Sure, come on in. So he comes on in, and I turn to go get the Band-Aids. I find our first aid kit, I turn around, door's still wide open, but he's gone. Nowhere to be seen. I did a little bit of research later when I got home. I found out that the place where we stayed used to be an old doctor's office. And what happened was that this time, there was someone that had come in that had gotten injured from mining and had actually ended up dying because he bled out and didn't get the care that he needed in this hospital where we were staying. Now, the really interesting thing about this story, none of my family saw anyone enter the house when I opened the door. So if you are ever in Pioche and you hear the wind blow, just remember, bloody fingers only needs a Band-Aid.
The name of my story is The House on Poplar Hill. 13 miles northwest of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, lies the little town of Hillsboro. It sits on the banks of the Eno River, and its history goes all the way back to colonial times. Now, within its historic district, there is a neighborhood known as Poplar Hill, and the homes that stand in that neighborhood date anywhere from the middle 1700s to the late 1800s. Now, one house in particular that is the subject of this tale actually got its start outside of the Hillsboro Township. It too once sat on the banks of the Eno River. It was a slender, stark building with long, slender sets of windows, like pairs of eyes that looked out over the riverbank. It was surrounded by woods that even to this day are considered haunted by the spirits of the Native American tribes that once peopled that area, haunted by the spirits of the colonial settlers who died trying to gain a foothold in this new land in order to make a better life for themselves and their families. And even, they say, spirits of Confederate and Union soldiers who fought and died in local skirmishes still wander those woods. Now, about 120 years ago, the current owner at that time of this house had it picked up off its original foundation and transferred into Poplar Hill, where they sat it down on an extensive piece of property. Ever after that move, that home went through numerous ownerships, very frequently being bought and sold. And whenever it was inhabited, the people only lasted there maybe a year, maybe two, and then it would be sold again. But most of the time, the house was vacant. On September 3rd, 2016, the house went under ownership of Tom and Brooke Maxwell. Now, Tom Maxwell is the lead guitar player for the 1990s rock group, the Squirrel Nut Zippers. He, love the name, he and Brooke wanted to raise their children away from the risks of being in an urban environment in a more country-like setting. And they were drawn to the house's ample room and the very slender, plain lines. So they moved in there, began to feather their nest, and tried to make the house their home. But very soon they would come to realize that they, in that house, were not alone. Very shortly after moving there, Brooke's mother came to visit. And when she did, she and Brooke went out into the extensive backyard area. Brooke was showing her around when suddenly, when they turned back towards the house, over to their right, in a little grove of poplar trees, stood the figure of a woman dressed in colonial outfit, looking off into the distance with her hands seemingly resting on a poplar tree. They stood there in stunned silence until they watched the figure vanish. A little while later, Tom was sitting by himself on the front porch, enjoying a very early fall evening. He was looking forward when suddenly, in his right peripheral vision, he thought he saw movement. He turned to look, and there, coming seemingly from the bushes on the right-hand side of the property, was the spectral image of a young Native American brave who silently sauntered across the yard and exited out into the bushes on the left-hand side. But then there was also the smiling woman whose perimeter seemed to be within the confines of the kitchen. Brooke would be making dinner, and then suddenly she'd get this hinky feeling like something was behind her. She would turn around, and there for an instant, she would see this almost contemporarily dressed woman smiling. And then it would vanish. But what that specter loved to do the most, it seemed like, was to watch the family at dinner. So in an adjoining dining room, the family would be eating when suddenly her head would appear around the door frame. And when they would see her, she would, and then disappear around the corner of the door. Family members would upstart and run into the kitchen to check it out, and nothing. And then, of course, there was also the wall man. He would emerge and disappear in the walls. He showed up in various walls in various places in the home, always with startling effect to whoever watched him. But the one that came later on that began to disturb them was Old Spaghetti Arms. He was a specter that would show up when Brooke and Tom were sitting on the front porch, day or evening. He would come out of the thicket, a thicket that was in front of the woods across the road from the home. He would come out in homespun breeches, stockings, buckled shoes, a muslin shirt, waving his arms and crouched, walking forward to the property. And then he would stop at the perimeter, stare, and then back he would go again across the road into the thicket and disappear. Now, when he started showing up, Brooke and Tom became concerned, and they began to talk about the fact that the ghosts that were haunting their property were showing up more frequently, becoming more bold, and coming into closer proximity to the inhabitants, especially their children. This all came to a head one night when Brooke and Tom were going off to bed. They climbed the stairs and were going down the bedroom hallway when suddenly they heard one of their children, as if coming through the walls, they were having a disturbed dream of some kind. So they decided to check on her. So they opened the door to her bedroom, and much to their horror, they saw a long, tall female spirit. She had on old-fashioned full skirt, and she was bent completely at the waist. Almost nose to nose with their daughter. Well, Brooke screamed, and Tom threw on the lights, and the specter disappeared, and their daughter sat up in bed crying. And that's when Tom and Brooke realized that they had better move, because things were getting worse. So the very next day, they met with their real estate agent. They put the house up onto the market. They came home with loads of boxes, and they began to pack as quickly as they could all of their belongings. And when they did that, it seemed to wake up all the spirits that were in the house. The smiling woman would smile from around the stacks of boxes in the kitchen. The wall man would slip out from behind a stack of boxes in the living room. And spaghetti arms began to get closer and closer to the front porch. So they got everything together. They got it in boxes. Tom came up with a rental rider truck, and they got everything in the back of the truck and the car. And then there was one thing left to do. Once they got the children into the car, Brooke and Tom had a job. They had heard that salt has spiritual qualities, that if it's dropped around the perimeter of a haunted property, it contains within it the haunting, so no spirits can follow. And they did not want to be followed. So they took their boxes of salt, and Tom and Brooke followed each other around the perimeter of the property, dropping a thick line of salt around the entire thing. And when they were done, Brooke got into the car with the children. Tom locked the front door and headed to the rider truck, but not before he took one last look at the house. And there, in those long, thin windows like eyes, he saw Wall Man pacing back and forth in front of the window, looking like he wanted to get out, but he couldn't. And then the family took off and went to Chapel Hill. Now, that was about 7 years ago, and in those 7 years, the house changed hands again. The last time it was bought was a year ago, right now, and yet no one is living in it. But since Tom and Brooke Maxwell have gone public with their haunting story, that house now sits very solidly on the Hillsborough Nightly Ghost Tour. All of the participants stand on the sidewalk staring into those long, slender windows, wondering what in the world would have made Tom and Brooke move so quickly, and what would happen to any new residents who might move in. Because everyone knows that something bad is going on in the house on Poplar Hill. Thank you.
I want to tell you about the worst date ever. 4 decades ago, I was a student in Utah Valley, and there was a guy named Carl that I was kind of sweet on. And the thing I liked is that he asked me out to a date to the Timpanogos Cave in American Fork. Now, see, I've always wanted to date this guy because he always had these adventures he was telling about. And so we met at the top of the cave, and he says, now, don't tell anybody, but I have access to a different route than the tourists take, and we get to go and see a different part of the cave. I was all the more excited. And so as the tour group went into the cave, they went left, and we went right. He says, do not turn on your flashlight yet. We continued down the path. The light started getting dimmer and dimmer as we walked away from the entrance of the cave. And then we saw some restricted tape, do not pass tape, on an opening, a cave opening. I says, are you sure we have permission? We do. We went through the tape. He says, keep going, don't turn on your flashlight yet. Finally, okay. When we turned on the flashlights and we showed the beams high up into the cavern, what we saw was amazing. The limestone seemed to glow and shimmer with water drizzling down this limestone columns and the walls of the cavern. It was absolutely stunning. And there were stalactites that were spiraling down from the ceiling. And they had tints of pink from carbon minerals mixed up with the other minerals, and the water dripping down, making a long tooth. And then from the bottom on the ground level of the chamber was stalagmites that were rising as the water would drizzle on the minerals and would continue to grow. And there were multiple teeth distributed about the chamber. And the walls curved and turned, and some of them spiraled down deep into pits as the water continued to drizzle down into the chamber. It was absolutely beautiful. You glad you came? I am. And also that you're kind of cute, but I won't mention that. And as we continued along the path, we saw a chamber and a chamber and a chamber. It was all stunning. But the thing that was scary was that the path that we were on was 1/3 up the chamber, and it slanted because the water would drizzle down the wall and slide off the path 2 to 4 feet wide at different points, and then pivot and go clear down and go down into the depths below with the twisting and turning rocks. And it was scary because sometimes the width would be narrow and sometimes the width would be 4 feet, and you're kind of tilting toward the edge of the path. And he says, there's a trick. He says, bend your knee on the right knee and keep your legs straight and walk like that so that you're pointing more toward the cave, toward the cave wall. Now, I wanted to touch the wall to kind of give myself additional support, but I couldn't because I knew that human touch would interfere with the ecosystem of the cave. So we were kind of wobbling down the path, and it was slippery because of the water and the minerals drizzling down, and the water would splash in our shoes, and I kept sliding, and I'm thinking, idiot, why would you wear tennis shoes in a cave? You should be wearing boots. What an idiot. And then I also thought as we went from path to path, Carl, did he even know how dangerous this is? I mean, the edges of that path and slanting and dropping off into the pits below. And we continued and went to Bisab. I didn't want to complain. I wanted to make an impression. And as we continued from cavern to cavern to cavern, and as we continued down the path, there was a tunnel. Now, the first part of the tunnel was pretty big. So we went walking through the tunnel, and then it began to narrow and tighten around us. And the rock was pressing down, the water was drizzling, drip, 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 water oozing down on our shoulders and our backs. It was normally 45 degrees in the cave, and with a jacket that's fine, but when you have cold water, shivering water slither down your back and sides, you're more than cold, you're starting to freeze. And as the cave narrowed, Carl called, Melva! Melva! He had to grab my arm and pull me through the rest of the tunnel, and only on the other side did I realize I have claustrophobia. And we're here in the middle of a mountain, in a cave, with perilous conditions, and all I need to do is panic. It's okay, Melva. Carl tries to assure me. I'm making a great impression right now. As we continue along the path, we come to a cavern, and there's a whole bunch of black splotches up along the ceiling and the walls. And as we do our flashlight up high, we learn the bats. And they start spiraling around because the light surprises them. We were both panicking as the bats kept hitting us, and we kept... Let's just say neither of us were calm at the moment. We finally are still hitting at the bats and realize that there's no more bats. And I mean, one turmoil after another. I'm not having fun anymore. As we calm down, I notice that the room is a lot dimmer. Carl admits my flashlight fell, rolled off the path. It's down in the pit below. Great. I reach down to the dark shadow of the pit, and I see that my own flashlight is on the edge, about to tip over into the pits of below. And I reach down to grab it. It's a bat! I got so excited, he did too. So we're both like, it's definitely not square dancing. As we calm down, I do see the flashlight, and I grab it, and I hold on to that thing, and I don't know if my shaking is from the cold, from trying to calm down, or the growing terror I have in this cave. And then I notice the flashlight is dimming. I need your backup batteries. I didn't bring any, Carl says. What an idiot. You learn a lot about someone in a turmoil. As I say, we're heading back. But the underground pond is just a little bit further. We're heading back. All I could think of is that flashlight going out and being surrounded with drizzling water, the fingers of darkness coming closer and closer, and taking a misstep on that trail and falling off into the pits below, because it was awful steep. We head back. It's much slower. When we reach the cave, Carl doesn't wait. He shoves me through the cave before I have a chance. I mean, it's a quick panic. What can I say? As we continue along the path, I slip and I fall on the trail, and Carl grabs my hand so I don't slither off the side. And we continue back, and the flashlight is dimming. And I tell you, I'm starting to hyperventilate, not because of claustrophobia, but just the darkness coming closer and pressing around us. And 15 yards away, we hear voices. We must be near the entrance, Carl says. And then he falls. And then Carl! And it, thump, 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 thump. Carl? I want to scream. And believe me, I have a high-pitched voice. It can shatter crystal. But I've got to control myself. I must be calm. I hurry to the entrance. Police officers and rescue crews are there to help us. We never did find Carl. Thank you.
When I was 12 years old, our family lived in a cul-de-sac, and in the circle of houses, they were just teeming with children. And I was the only one that was babysitting age. And so I had all the babysitting jobs a girl could possibly want. And I was raking it in 50 cents an hour. It was a while ago. But I loved with the kids. I knew all the children in the little circle of homes, and I just would play with them. It was fun. Well, the house directly across from our house, the family moved out, and another family moved in, the Huntleys. Now, the Huntleys, they were just a little different than all of these other houses teeming with children and family life. They were, Mr. Huntley, he was never home. I mean, you'd see him rip out every morning in the car and drive, and then late at night you'd hear him drive back up the driveway. Sometimes he never did come home. He was just gone all the time. And then there was Mrs. Huntley, and she didn't leave the house. She would occasionally go outside in the yard and kind of wander around, and neighbors would said, "Hi," and she'd just nicely smile and fade back into the house. And she always had this glass, this clear glass filled with ice and this blue liquid. And when she would drink, her hand would shake. They had one child, a little 7-year-old boy. His name was Benji. And at first glance, Benji he looked pretty much like any other 7-year-old child. He had long arms and his skinny legs, and he had close-cropped brown hair. But then there was his eyes. They were this pale, pale blue. When he'd look at me, I felt like I was peering through this clear water down to white sand. Now, my brother John, he was 7 years old as well, and so of course Benji and John started to play with each other. And John, he was just this sweet little boy, never got into trouble. It drove me nuts. But when he started playing with Benji, he suddenly was in trouble all the time. He would do things like sneak off, not telling anybody where he was. Big rule in our family. And then the neighbors started complaining that they would find Benji and John. They would find them in their backyard, or they would find them breaking something, or things were starting to disappear in the neighborhood. About 2 weeks after the Huntleys had moved into the house, Mrs. Huntley called me. "I understand that you tend children, and we need someone to watch our son. Would you be available? We'll pay you $2.50 an hour." $2.50 an hour. Yeah, I can do that. And so the next night I walked over to their house, and Mrs. Huntley, she let me in. She showed me through the house, and she gave me instructions like bedtime, things like that. And Benji, he was right there with her. That's just watching her intently. I didn't see Mr. Huntley until just before they left. He came charging through the room right past me, stopped just long enough for Benji to say, "Now, boy, you be good, you hear? And don't you have no trouble." "Oh, I'll be good, Daddy, I promise." And as soon as the door closed behind his parents, Benji looked at me. "You can't tell me to do nothing." And that's when I began to earn that $2.50 an hour. He spit at me. He kicked at me. He called me names. He said things that it was until I was in college when I understood what he was actually saying. He was just, he told me I was stupid and ugly and how much my brother hated me. And bedtime, it was a 2-hour ordeal before he finally fell asleep. I sat on the couch staring at the wall. The Huntleys came home. It was late, around midnight or so. And Mrs. Huntley asked me if I'd babysit again later on in the week. And I hesitated, and she said, "We'll pay you $3.50 an hour." Well, I figured I could put up with Benji for a few hours here and there, and that's what I did. For weeks and weeks, I would, 2 times a week, would go over and I'd babysit Benji, and he was miserable. Bedtime was always the worst. In fact, there was one night where it was 4 hours to get him into bed. And he was kicking and screaming and throwing things, and he'd charge into his room, and I'd tear things apart, and he'd come screaming out, and he'd go back into his room, and then finally, after 4 hours, there was quiet in the room. And I opened the door, and I looked inside, and I could see this little body underneath the covers. I closed the door. The Huntleys didn't get home till about 2 o'clock in the morning that time. And when they walked into the house, out comes Benji going, "Hi, Mom and Daddy. I've been awake the whole time." I couldn't believe it. A little snot. Well, his daddy, he did pay me my $3.50 an hour, but then he also paid me an extra $5. Next morning, I found out from my brother John that Benji, at around midnight, had come over to our house and had knocked on John's window and trying to get him to sneak out. But John, at that point, he was grounded till about age 15, so he didn't go for it. And when I realized that Benji had snuck out on me, it burned me. I had another appointment with him the next night, and I just thought, sucker, you're not doing that to me again. So I came out with a plan. I walked over that night, armed with a flashlight and our full-grown black Labrador, Andy. And we went over to the Huntleys. I tied up our dog outside. I left the flashlight with him. Benji was his usual miserable self. Finally, he went to sleep. I didn't just stand at the door and look to see if he was asleep. I walked into his room, and I could just hear that soft breathing in and out. I then went over and made sure that the window was locked. I closed his bedroom door. I went through the house, locked all the windows, locked all of the doors to make certain that there wouldn't be anybody getting in or out. I then took the one key that Mrs. Huntley had left for me, dropped it in my pocket, went outside, and with Andy and the flashlight, patrolled the yard. It was a quiet night. You'd hear an occasional dog bark or a voice in the distance of a neighbor, and then the crickets chirping, that rhythmic chirping. We patrolled for about an hour when something was different. The crickets, they were quiet. I felt Andy stiffen beside me, and he let out a low growl. And I looked to where his body was pointed, and that's when I saw him. This man, he was walking along the road that led to the cul-de-sac. And I could see him at a distance because he was taller than the houses and the street lights. He had long arms, and there was this bluish glow. It was radiating from him. He was coming towards the cul-de-sac, and when he reached the corner, he turned and started walking towards me and Andy. And I wanted to run. I wanted to run so bad, but I couldn't move. And Andy, he was just stock still. And as he walked towards us, with each step he took, he grew smaller, and the blue light grew dimmer, and smaller, and dimmer, and smaller, and dimmer, until he was the size of a 7-year-old boy. Benji. Benji raised his finger. Shh. He walked past us, and I was able to turn my head just enough to watch him towards the house. And as he approached the sliding glass doors, the doors that I had locked earlier, without him touching them, the doors slid open. He stepped inside, and without him touching them, the doors slid shut, and I heard the of the lock. I fell to my knees. I wrapped my arms around Andy, and he was whimpering and trembling, and we did not go back into that house. We sat on the front lawn, and as soon as the Huntleys drove up, I made a beeline right home. The next morning, Mrs. Huntley came to our front door. She paid me the money that they owed me from the night before, plus a $10 bonus. She asked me if I'd babysit for them again. And I told her no. And I handed her the house key. And the glass with the blue drink, the ice cubes were clicking. Of course, I understand. And she turned and she walked back to the house, and I never saw her again. I became the best big sister to my brother John. I took him everywhere. We went to the beach. We played whatever game he wanted to play. I would take him to movies. I'd buy him ice cream. I made sure that he was too busy to have anything to do with Benji. That lasted for about 3 months, and then the Huntleys moved, and I became an okay sister again. I tried to tell my mom and dad, but whenever I would start the story, I'd lose the words. I tried for years to tell the story, but the same thing would happen no matter who I was with until I was in college. And I was with my roommates. We were playing Truth and Dare, and I finally told them what happened. That's when the nightmares stopped. And now I'm telling you. I just hope I can sleep tonight.
Thank you. If you ever go back in the woolly swamp, well, you better not go at night. Oh, there's things out there in the middle of them woods. It makes strong men cry with fright. There's things that crawl, things that fly, and things that creep around on the ground. And they say the ghost of Lucius Clay gets up and he walks around. I couldn't believe it. Well, I just had to find out for myself because I couldn't conceive it. No, I never would listen to nobody else. I couldn't believe it. I just had to find out for myself. There's some things in this world you just can't explain. The old man lived in the woolly swamp way back in Groverwood. He never did do no harm in the world, but he never did do no good. People, they didn't think too much of him. They all thought he acted funny. The old man, he didn't care about people anyway. All he cared about was his money. Yeah, he'd stuff it all down in mason jars and bury it all around. And on certain nights, when the moon was right, he'd dig it up out of the ground. Oh, he'd spread it all over the floor of that shack and run his fingers through it. Yeah, Lucius Clay was a greedy old man. Now, that's all there was to it. But I couldn't believe it. Well, I just had to find out for myself because I just couldn't conceive it. No, I never would listen to nobody else. I couldn't believe it. I just had to find out for myself because there are some things in this world you just can't explain. The cable boys, oh, they was white trash. lived over on Carver's Creek. They was mean as snakes, sneaky as cats, and belligerent when they'd speak. One night, the oldest brother said, "Y'all meet me in the woolly swamp later. We'll take old Lucius's money and we'll feed him to the alligators." Oh, they found the old man. Out in the back, he had a shovel in his hand. 13 rusty mason jars just dug up out of the sand. And they all went crazy and they beat the old man and they picked him up off the ground and they threw him in the swamp. And they stood there and laughed as the black water sucked him down. They turned around, went back to that shack, picked up the money and ran. They hadn't gone nowhere when they realized they was running in quicksand. And they struggled and they screamed, but they couldn't get away. And just before they went under, they could hear that old man laughing in a voice as loud as thunder. It's been 50 years ago. You can go by there yet. There is a spot in the yard on the back of that shack where the ground is always wet. And on certain nights, when the moon is right on the edge of that dark footpath, you can hear 3 young men screaming. And you can hear one old man laugh. Oh, if you ever go back in the woolly swamp, well, you better not go at night. There are things out there in the middle of them woods make strong men cry with fright. There's things that crawl, things that fly, things that creep around on the ground. And take my word, I know for sure, the ghost of a Lucius Clay, oh, he gets up and he walks around.
Ladies and gentlemen, the votes are in. Now I can say that the audience votes perfectly matched the judging votes for our top 3 winners. So, with no further ado, I will announce the 3rd place winner of the Utah Hauntings 2024 contest is, drumroll please, Melva Gifford. And for tonight, we have a certificate for you. Fantastic, as always, Melva. In 2nd place, according to the audience and the judges, is Lynn Wing. Well done. And in 1st place, the winner of Utah Hauntings 2024, also known as Utah's scariest storyteller, Stephanie Rollheiser. Fantastic. Well done.